You have millions of gallons of water pouring down from the north with the snow caps in Canada, and they have essentially a very large faucet.
The sky over Los Angeles wasn't red, it was burning. Entire neighborhoods disappeared behind walls of flame as emergency crews raced from one collapsing fire line to the next. In a single night, the world's most famous city looked less like a symbol of glamour and more like the front line of a climate war no one was winning. And as the smoke drifted north, so did the political shockwaves. Because while Californians fought for their homes, Donald Trump made a statement that ignited an entirely different kind of firestorm, this one across the border in Canada. At a January rally, he looked into the cameras and said Canada had a giant faucet up north, a massive water tap that could simply be opened to send water flowing down to drought-stricken California. To millions of Americans frustrated by heat waves, dry reservoirs, and failing crops, the line sounded almost reassuring. A simple fix, a neighborly solution, just turn the handle. But in Canada, it was the opposite. It was an alarm bell. To Ottawa, Trump's comment didn't sound like policy, it sounded like possession. It turned Canada's most sacred natural resource, its rivers, lakes, and snow-fed watersheds, into something transactional, something Washington believed it could claim in a moment of desperation. And for a country built around conservation, stewardship, and a deep cultural reverence for water, that one-word faucet hit like a slap. Because behind it was a message Canada had been hearing more often. That the United States no longer saw them as an equal partner, but as a reservoir waiting to be tapped. And as wildfires raged in the south and political rhetoric escalated in the north, one question began to surface with dangerous clarity. What happens when a superpower starts eyeing its neighbor's water as the next strategic resource? In the days after Trump's Faucet remark, something shifted quietly but unmistakably in Washington. Without holding a press conference or issuing a formal explanation, U.S. officials placed an unexpected freeze on negotiations to modernize the Columbia River Treaty, a cornerstone agreement that has governed cross-border water flows and hydroelectric cooperation for more than half a century. The talks had been progressing under President Biden, with both sides signaling optimism. Under Trump's return, that optimism evaporated almost overnight. Canadian officials noticed first. Then they connected the dots. The pause didn't look like a bureaucratic delay. It looked like leverage. And when whispers began circulating that new tariffs on Canadian exports were being considered, Ottawa realized the United States was preparing to turn water, once a shared responsibility, into a bargaining chip. British Columbia's Energy Minister, Adrian Dix, didn't hold back. Standing before a row of microphones, he condemned what he called a wave of vicious anti-Canadian attacks and warned that weaponizing trade to gain access to Canadian water would trigger a backlash far greater than Washington expected. His tone reflected something deeper than politics. A cultural line crossed, a national boundary tested. But it was Prime Minister Mark Carney who delivered the message that truly crystallized Canada's stance. In an unusually blunt address from Parliament Hill, Carney declared that water was not a commodity, not a political tool, and certainly not a foreign policy concession. It was a pillar of Canadian sovereignty, an inheritance of geography, history, and identity that no government would ever negotiate under pressure. Carney's speech struck like a thunderclap. Within hours, the story dominated Canadian media. Analysts called it the strongest public defense of water rights in modern Canadian history. Citizens flooded social platforms with messages of support, accusing Washington of entitlement and warning that Canada's rivers were not for sale. What began as a careless line at a rally had spiraled into a diplomatic confrontation, and with treaty negotiations frozen, trade tensions rising, and anger hardening on both sides of the border, one thing became clear. This wasn't just a dispute about water. It was the beginning of a new era in North American power politics. South of the border, the crisis that fueled Trump's rhetoric was growing darker by the day. California, once the pride of American agriculture and a symbol of endless prosperity, was drying out in real time. Reservoir levels that had supported tens of millions of people for generations had fallen to historic lows. The Colorado River, the lifeline of the American West, was shrinking so quickly that satellite images looked like before and after photos of a vanished civilization. Fields turned to dust. Orchards died standing. Entire counties began drilling deeper and deeper wells, only to hit saltwater or collapsing aquifers. For years, policymakers tried to downplay the emergency, but by 2024, the veneer of control cracked. Water wasn't a policy issue anymore, it was a survival crisis. Former International Joint Commission official Rob Sisson put it bluntly in an interview that ricocheted across U.S. media. Water security in California is national security for food, health, and the country itself. And that's where desperation began, feeding into geopolitics. Because as America's most fertile state edged toward collapse, Washington started searching for solutions outside its borders. Every potential fix came with problems. Desalination plants burned through billions, yet produced only fractions of what the state needed. Groundwater pumping created sinkholes and structural instability. Water transfers between states sparked lawsuits, protests, and political standoffs that froze cooperation. America was running out of water and out of time. That's when analysts began revisiting Trump's remark, not as an offhand insult, but as a window into a strategic mindset. The Columbia River system supplies almost 40% of America's hydroelectric power, but much of that water starts in Canada. To a nation staring down a future of scarcity, that upstream reality wasn't just geographic, it was geopolitical leverage they didn't control. And as America's drought worsened, the idea of Canadian water stopped being a hypothetical. It became something else, a pressure point, a vulnerability, a resource Washington increasingly felt entitled to. Canada saw the shift long before Americans admitted it, and that realization would shape what Ottawa did next. Ottawa didn't wait for Washington to make the next move. The freeze on the Columbia River Treaty, the tariff threats, and the increasingly casual American rhetoric about Canadian water had revealed something deeper. The United States no longer viewed Canada as a partner, but as a reservoir. And if Canada didn't redefine the terms of engagement now, it would soon be negotiating from a position of weakness. So Ottawa pivoted quietly, strategically, and with a precision that caught even seasoned analysts off guard. Instead of debating water exports or entering reactive diplomacy, Canada began reshaping its economy around something far more powerful than raw resources: control over water-based innovation. Ministries across British Columbia, Quebec, Alberta, and the Maritimes were instructed to accelerate investments in water tech infrastructure. The goal wasn't to sell water. The goal was to build an economic fortress around it. Behind closed doors, policymakers called it the water tech doctrine. Smart irrigation networks powered by AI were deployed to protect agricultural output. Advanced water recycling systems, once niche environmental projects, became national priorities. Research funding poured into precision hydrology, glacier monitoring, and clean tech hydroengineering. Even Canada's dam management protocols were upgraded with real-time data analytics to optimize flow and protect biodiversity. What looked from afar like environmental stewardship was something else entirely. Canada building an economic moat around the very resource Washington was eyeing. And the message was subtle but unmistakable. If the United States wanted access to the future of water, it wouldn't be through extraction or pipelines. It would be through Canadian expertise, Canadian technology, and Canadian systems on Canada's terms. The pivot wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it was a turning point, because for the first time, Canada wasn't just defending its rivers, it was weaponizing its mastery of water management, transforming national identity into national strategy. And that strategy was about to reshape the continent. Canada's pivot around water management did more than protect its sovereignty. It unlocked a transformation that had been years in the making, one the world had largely overlooked until the United States pushed too hard. As Washington battled internal chaos and climate emergencies, Ottawa began stitching together the foundations of a new economic identity, a nation powered not by extraction, but by sustainable strength. By 2023, nearly a third of all foreign direct investment flowing into Canada targeted green and sustainable projects, a six-fold surge in just 3 years. Investors weren't guessing. They were following signals: stability, predictability, and a clean energy grid unlike anything in the G7. With 82% of its electricity coming from renewable sources, Canada suddenly offered what every modern manufacturer craved: cheap, reliable, and green power. That advantage echoed across the provinces. In Ontario and Quebec, global automakers began anchoring their EV and battery supply chains around hydro-powered industrial corridors. In British Columbia, clean tech firms specializing in water treatment, recycling, and precision agriculture positioned themselves as world leaders. Even Alberta, long associated with oil, accelerated its diversification into green hydrogen and carbon capture. But the real inflection point came with the Canada-EU Green Alliance, a landmark agreement that turned environmental credibility into economic currency. The deal granted Canadian exporters a privileged bridge into Europe's rapidly expanding clean tech market, precisely as the United States erected tariff walls and retreated into isolationism. While Washington debated crisis responses, Canada was designing the future. Its trade networks now stretched into markets representing 60% of global GDP. Its environmental standards aligned with global expectations. Its water tech innovations became the backbone of new international partnerships. Ottawa didn't need to shout about its rise. The world was already watching. In a continent shaken by drought, fire, and political volatility, Canada's calm wasn't a weakness. It was a strategic asset, and one transforming quiet confidence into quiet power. As Canada methodically built its new green industrial backbone, Washington doubled down on the only tool it felt still carried weight: tariffs. The logic was simple: pressure. Canada economically, extract leverage diplomatically, and force Ottawa back to the negotiating table over water. But every tariff the United States launched seemed to misfire, ricocheting across supply chains in ways American strategists hadn't fully anticipated. The first cracks appeared in the auto sector. When Washington slapped new duties on Canadian metals and components, U.S. automakers responded not by reshoring their supply chains, but by shifting future investments northward. They needed stable electricity, predictable policies, and access to green credits advantages the U.S. grid and regulatory climate simply couldn't match, and Canada offered all of them. Then came the battery shock. In a development that stunned analysts, Bloomberg NEF ranked Canada, not the United States, not China, not South Korea, as the top country in the world for future battery supply chain potential. The reason was as simple as it was strategic: clean energy, abundant critical minerals, and a government willing to invest billions where Washington debated endlessly. Within months, more than $46 billion USD in private investment poured into EV and battery plants across Ontario and Quebec. These weren't symbolic projects, they were long-term infrastructure commitments from global giants betting on Canada as a manufacturing anchor for the next half-century. What was meant to weaken Ottawa had instead strengthened it. American tariffs turned into a gravitational force, pulling capital, talent, and technological ecosystems northward. Instead of isolating Canada, Washington's pressure accelerated its rise. And with every new plant announcement, every green tech partnership, every international alliance signed outside America's orbit, the geopolitical balance of the continent shifted a little further. America First, in practice, was becoming Canada Ascendant, a reversal no strategist in Washington had anticipated, yet one they were increasingly forced to acknowledge. Canada wasn't just weathering the storm, it was turning the storm into momentum. As North America's political tension deepened, the rest of the world began paying attention not to the insults, not to the tariffs, but to the resource at the center of it all. Water, once treated as an afterthought in geopolitics, was now revealing itself as the defining power variable of the 21st century. And in a planet growing hotter, thirstier, and more unstable each year, the nation with the cleanest, coldest, and most abundant reserves wasn't a military giant or an oil titan. It was Canada. Across Europe, droughts had pushed rivers so low that commercial shipping stalled. In the Middle East, aquifer depletion triggered agricultural collapse and mass migration. In Asia, megacities fought over shrinking reservoirs. The world was beginning to understand what Canada had quietly protected for generations. Water is destiny, and the countries that steward it will become the anchors in an age of scarcity. This global awakening reshaped foreign policy overnight. Brussels fast-tracked environmental and trade alliances with Ottawa. Tokyo expanded climate tech collaborations, seeing Canada's water governance model as a blueprint for its own resilience planning. Even Delhi, facing record heat waves, sought joint research agreements on glacier preservation and watershed management. While the United States wavered between crisis response and political turbulence, Canada was signing deals, creating corridors of cooperation, and becoming a hub for green diplomacy. Analysts began calling it the biggest soft power shift since the rise of oil in the 20th century. Only this time, power didn't roar from pipelines or refineries. It flowed quietly through rivers, reservoirs, and rain-fed forests. Canada's advantage wasn't just abundance. It was discipline, its unwavering stance that water was a public trust, not a commodity. And in a world where stability itself had become a rare resource, that discipline turned into influence. Nations looked to Ottawa not just for technology or trade access, but for something more intangible: leadership. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the global balance of power began to tilt toward the country that guarded the source rather than the country that demanded the flow. In the end, the entire crisis circled back to the moment it began. A wildfire-choked California, a desperate nation staring into a future of thirst, and one offhand remark from Donald Trump that echoed far louder than anyone expected. He called Canada a faucet, an image so casual, so dismissive, that it lit up an entire country overnight. But months later, as the dust settled and the geopolitics hardened, the metaphor revealed something deeper. Because Canada is not a faucet, it is the source. The rivers Trump wanted to redirect aren't pipes. They are ancient, glacier-fed arteries carved over millennia. They shape ecosystems, power grids, and indigenous homelands. They define borders, economies, and identities. They are not handles to be turned based on the political mood of the moment. And that is what Washington never anticipated. As the United States scrambled to respond to drought, internal division, and collapsing infrastructure, Canada moved with quiet precision, transforming water from a vulnerability into a strategic shield, then into an engine of national renewal. While America fought crises, Canada built alliances. While Washington tried to impose pressure, Ottawa converted pressure into power. The world watched the contrast unfold. One nation burned, grasping for solutions. The other flowed steady, deliberate, unyielding. But the real story isn't about treaties, tariffs, or even Trump's remark. It's about something much larger: the emergence of water as the central force shaping global politics. Oil defined the last century. Water will define the next. And the country that guards the source does not just gain protection, it gains influence. And that leads to the question the world is beginning to whisper, the question that will shape the geopolitics of the century ahead. In an era shaped by scarcity, who truly holds power? The nation that builds the dams, or the nation that owns the rivers? Thank you for watching. If this story opened your eyes, tap like and subscribe. Every click helps bring truth to the surface.